Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum. Thank you all for joining us tonight, both those of you who are here in person as well as all of our virtual viewers as well. It's a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's forum, which is a conversation with Dr. Lindsay Travinsky and Dr. Megan Kate Nelson about John Adams' 5-year battle to defend the presidency and how his leadership and legacy define the office and ensure the survival of the American Republic. So Dr. Lindsay Travinsky is the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Prior to her current and recently appointed role, she said just 2 months ago, she was a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. She received her BA in History and Political Science from George Washington University and completed her master's and PhD from the University of California, Davis. She's been awarded fellowships at the Library of Congress, the Institute of Thomas Paine Studies, the International Center for Jefferson Studies, the Society of the Cincinnati, and Mount Vernon. So Travinsky is the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, co-editor of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, and her newest book is Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. She regularly writes for public audiences in the Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, The Daily Beasts, The Bulwark, Time Magazine, USA Today, CNN, and The Washington Post, and regularly offers insight on TV, radio, and podcasts. So tonight, Travinsky will be in conversation with Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, a historian of the American Civil War, the U.S. West, and popular culture, who has written articles about these topics for the New York Times, Washington Post, Time, The Atlantic, Slate, and Smithsonian Magazine. Currently, she's the 2024-2025 Rogers Distinguished Fellow in 19th Century American History at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. Nelson is the author of The Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West, which was a finalist for the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in History. Her new book, Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation and Reconstruction America, was published in 2022 on the 150th anniversary of the Yellowstone Act, which created the first national park in the world. A fellow of the Society of American Historians, Megan is also a regular guest on radio shows and TV documentaries about Western history and popular culture. Before leaving academia to write full-time in 2014, she taught U.S. History and American Studies at Texas Tech University, Cal State Fullerton, Harvard, and Brown. So in the final weeks of this pivotal election year, the ideas and legacy of John Adams' presidency are ever resonant. So please join me in welcoming Lindsay Travinsky and Megan Kate Nelson.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight with us in real life and virtually. I feel like I should disclose that Lindsay and I are very good friends for a long time, and we also are in a writing workshop together. So I had the great pleasure of reading the first couple chapters of Making the Presidency in their draft form. So we may talk a little bit about sort of process and that sort of thing. But I think the first burning question for you would be, why Adams?
It's an excellent question and a great place to start. So when I finished writing my first book, The Cabinet, I had written about how Washington had created this presidency and established all of these precedents. But Washington was such an unusual figure in American history. He was so unparalleled in his stature. He was so widely respected in a way that no other president has been since or will ever be. That there was a real question at the time, and I was really plagued by this question of, how did the presidency work for anyone else? Would it work for anyone else? And Adams was interesting to me because Adams knew how difficult that question would be to answer. He knew how difficult it would be to follow George Washington and to inevitably fall short in the public estimation. And yet he did it anyway. And so I was very intrigued by that possibility. I was very intrigued of, how do you do succession planning for a brand new presidency? And then January 6th happened. And I realized that I was taking for granted American institutions. And I was taking for granted the peaceful transfer of power. despite the fact that I had spent many years studying them. And I started looking for what did Adams do to create those early peaceful transfers of power. And by asking those questions, I was starting to unlock very small, very nuanced, often behind the scenes decisions that Adams made to start to cultivate this practice, to start to get it going, to teach Americans how to cherish it. And I realized that most of the other great biographers of John Adams, many of whom lived in New England, they had not lived through that type of transition. They had not seen it. And so they were not asking those questions. It doesn't mean they were wrong or that they got something, they missed something. It means that they were just asking different questions. And so my goal then with this book was to both explain these central elements of our American democracy, but also to sort of offer an argument of why I think Adams' presidency actually matters a great deal.
And I seem to remember back in the day, when you were conceiving of this project originally, it was going to be a study of both Adams and Jefferson. So
what happened?
What happened there? Oh, and I should say, actually, I know that usually the structure here is to kind of for us to talk for like 40 minutes and then for Q&A to start. But if you have a question while we're talking, we are perfectly fine with and happy to kind of recognize your question as we are chatting along. So just wanted to interject that. But so why did Jefferson get the boot?
So initially I had planned, long before January 6th happened, I had thought about writing a book about Adams and Jefferson's cabinets because they were so different and such different experiences. And I was looking to better understand the precedents that Washington had established and how they had continued. So I started writing that book. And then I realized I actually really didn't want to write the Jefferson book. And I didn't. Partly it was because I had already written an article about Jefferson's cabinet, and I kind of felt like I had said everything that I needed to say, but also partly because, and you know this so well when you're writing, especially if you're writing about one person or you're writing about an administration, which was really quite small at the time, and you're writing about them in great detail, you have to spend a lot of time in their head, and you have to spend a lot of time in their writings, and you have to spend a lot of time getting to know them. And I didn't really want to do that with Jefferson. So I remember our writing group meeting. I was like, I'm really struggling with this part. They said, well, why don't you just cut it off? Like the Adams part is the interesting part anyway. And I was like, oh wait, I can do that? They're like, yeah. I was like, great. And all of a sudden, that part of the book was deleted.
Mm-hmm. But Jefferson does show up. As does Hamilton, as does Washington, like three men who were greatly revered. I mean, Hamilton more so now since the, smash hit musical. But they don't really show up in the best light in this book. So what is it like to write about such mythic figures, including Adams, I think, in a way that recognizes their strengths, but also their weaknesses, the extent to which they are vengeful, the extent to which they kind of are in their feelings a lot of the time, like an actual, like, real people in 3D.
Yeah. So this is, I think, actually really the challenge of doing work about the founders in general, and it's one of the challenges that I enjoy the most because I am very honest about their flaws and sometimes call out Jefferson for his near treason-like behavior. But more importantly, I think their flaws are actually quite useful to us because they did do extraordinary things, and because they were flawed and they were human and they were petty and they made mistakes, it makes their extraordinariness all the more remarkable. And it means that if we're looking for people to do extraordinary things, we don't need to find flawless people in order to do that. So that is a much more relevant lesson for us today. We don't need to look for the second coming of this founding generation that is perfect. We need to find people who are flawed and are imperfect, but are willing to put their talents towards a greater good. And so I never shy away from the flaws. I embrace the flaws because I think, A, it makes them much more interesting. I think perfect people are probably pretty boring. And the snark and the sass and the grudges and the pettiness, that's what makes for a really good story. But also, it makes it helpful to us today to better understand how we can also get through moments of crisis with the people we have around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I enjoy most about this book and the way that you write about these sort of great men in history is that they're actually living people out moving around in the world. For those of you who have the book, if you're going to get the book tonight, there's a great map of Philadelphia, and you can see how close everyone lives to each other. They're basically all in the same neighborhood, right? And so when they go to have meetings or they go to kind of pay calls on one another, which was it was a social act, but it was also a political act. They're just right down the street. and it's such a nice kind of intimate way of thinking about these people who they seem unreachable, they seem untouchable.
I think this is one of the things I've learned so much from your writing is that the physical world building is so important because our lives are affected by the lived reality of our environment and where we live and who we live next to and where we shop and where we buy goods and who we interact with on a daily basis. And theirs was too. And it makes me laugh constantly that people who loathed each other lived right across the street from one another. Because Philadelphia was a tiny city at the time. I mean, it was very population dense, but in terms of the square footage of the city, it was tiny. So you could not escape people that you did not want to see because you often went to the same tailor or the same stationery shop or the same bookshop or the same post office. And you would walk out of your house and they would be right there. And so I find that very entertaining. And I do think it tells us a lot about the involved and very sort of intricate political nature of Philadelphia in the 1790s.
Mm-hmm. And also one of the things that you do that I think readers are really going to enjoy or are currently enjoying is that this is a really fine-grained depiction of a single term in a presidency. So you get to learn all about okay, well, what does a president actually do in the first couple of days, especially in this period? I mean, it's changed a fair bit, but what do they actually have to do? How do they go about doing things when they give an address to Congress? What actually happens? How do they send things to the printer? Things like that. And that's such a wonderful thing as a historian to be able to write that fine-grained history. But because you're doing that, you often have to leave out some things. So what did you have to leave out because of your kind of focus and the detail that you really wish that you could have addressed at greater length?
Yeah. So I should say it's not like a day by day. There are days that I skipped and try to focus on the big ones, or the ones that really made a difference. So I really think of this book as a book about the presidency through the lens of John Adams. It is not really a book about John Adams through the lens of the presidency. And that was very intentional on my part because I was trying to understand these political practices and this political institution. And I think the best way to do that at this time period is through the person who is inhabiting it. But that meant that I was sort of circumscribed by what they were actually focused on, what the presidency actually had something to do with. And the presidency didn't have a whole lot to do with a lot of domestic affairs at the time. So there was no agricultural department that was setting farm policy. There was no Department of Transportation who was focused on internal infrastructure. So those are things that are not in the book. And one of the other things that I do my best to incorporate when I'm building the community, but was not a topic of conversation, was slavery. Because slavery was not something that was really discussed at the political level in Adams' administration. By that point, Philadelphia had already passed its manumission laws. Congress was not really discussing it much. It was going to rear its head later, but it wasn't really on the agenda. And so, to be sure, it was a part of the lived experience in Philadelphia, which was a very interesting mix of free and enslaved and white and black. And when
John was in Philadelphia, they did hire out enslaved individuals from local families where they would pay the families for the labor of the enslaved. But that was about the extent of his interaction and his experience. And so it's always really important to acknowledge that I don't discuss it as a political concept, but it was very much there and always in the background.
Mm-hmm. And kind of Native American diplomacy also, right?
Yeah, Native American diplomacy by this point, it was sort of at a little bit of an ebb because Washington had sent the American army multiple times to the West to fight wars against Native nations and had signed treaties. And so there was a little bit of a gap here before conflict reemerged. And while, to be sure, Western settlement was continuing apace on Native land, it hadn't really bubbled up again into another period of conflict. So when Adams was thinking about diplomacy, he was thinking about Haiti. He was the first president to sign a trade agreement with a black-led nation. And he was thinking about Europe and all of the damage that the various European empires were trying to get up to and all of the havoc they were trying to wreak.
Mm-hmm. And one thing you do talk about, though, I mean, you don't talk about kind of gender really in the larger frame, but Abigail is a very important part of this story. Do you want to talk about her and kind of the role she plays in Adams's presidency?
I think that Abigail was probably the most fun part of this book to write. She was certainly the most fun part of this book for me to think about because she's one of my favorite parts about John Adams. There are very few founders who, when you dive into their relationship, you like them more. And John is one of them. Because he, to his great credit, understood that his wife was an amazing asset. And it wasn't just the remember the ladies letter, but rather daily letters of insight and savvy about politics and men and the people around them. Adams's critics referred to her as his cabinet of one, and that was intended as an insult, but it was actually quite accurate. And one of my favorite stories occurred in 1798 to sort of demonstrate how intimately she was involved in the political process. Secretary of War James McHenry came to the president's house. He had just gotten back from a trip, and he brought papers for Adams to review. And when he arrived, they were having breakfast. So McHenry came in and he handed John these papers, he reviewed them, and then he handed them to Abigail for her review and asked what she thought. So there were no secrets. There were no state secrets that were kept from the First Lady. She was an essential part of the presidency. And I think that that's super important when we think about the presidency because we often associate that type of political First Lady with Eleanor Roosevelt. We often associate it with the more modern presidents. But Abigail was really setting the trend all the way back in 1797.
So do you think, I mean, it's interesting to think about that in light of today's politics, right? Where, the first lady or potentially the first gentleman, we often wonder what their role is. Is it just, decorating the White House? There's the whole cookie baking situation, they're always kind of put in charge of something, but we never really hear about it. Maybe there's some initiatives, and I think to many people it can seem as kind of okay, it's important for the president to have a partner, but what that partner does, does it really matter politically? But so, in your view, is this relationship that they had really vital to the presidency, or do you think this was kind of unusual that Abigail and John and then the sort of Eleanor Roosevelt were kind of outliers in this sense?
I think it was definitely more unusual than not. So Martha Washington sort of set the expectation of that type of hostess First Lady. She was very important to George. He wanted her around. He felt like she is what made it home. She hosted really important social events that served as networking and behind-the-scenes political and politicking events that made bills happen and made treaties happen. And so she was essential, but she was not political. And from her letters, we can tell she really just didn't have any interest and didn't want to talk about it. She wanted to talk about the plantation. She wanted to talk about their home. She did not want to talk about politics. most first ladies have sort of followed that model, at least publicly. I'm sure that they had conversations privately. The problem with private conversations is we don't have a record of them. So we don't really know what they were talking about behind closed doors. What I think was interesting about Abigail, that was an exception, at least until more recently, but I would argue is still a topic of conversation, is everyone knew that she was important. Everyone knew that they were having these conversations because other people sought out her input too, because she was that well regarded as insightful. And sometimes when people felt like she would be on her side or on their side, they really liked that. And they would say, oh, I wish the old woman was there to give him advice on this subject. I quote directly. And other times they accused her of being overly political, of overly politicking. So that fine line between what was appropriate and what wasn't is, I think, a conversation that we are still very familiar with today. And understandably, the first lady or someday the first gentleman, they're not elected, so I understand that discomfort, but it is a very sort of bizarre and tricky dynamic, and one that the Adamses experienced firsthand.
But it does seem like, there is a role that the spouse plays in sort of providing a non-political conversation, providing time away, providing relaxation, like just allowing the president to just kind of have some time off.
Yeah, or alternatively, the spouse is probably the only person that can tell the president when they're being dumb, when they're wrong. They can't really be fired. And so they're one of the few people that can say no. That's not a good idea. And so often that check, even if it's just an ego check, is really important.
So would you say, so if we're like making a checklist of all of the kind of, I guess, characteristics or types of experience, because you mentioned early on that John Adams is probably the most well-qualified person ever to have become president, given all of the kind of jobs that he held and the experience that he had. So what's our kind of checklist for a truly qualified president, like someone who will bring, I mean, obviously we know they have weaknesses, but what, given what you kind of have seen in John Adams's presidency, is he kind of a model for what we might expect from a current president today?
Well, I think that the hard part about making a checklist is that no matter how carefully a candidate campaigns, no matter how clearly they articulate what their platform is going to be, world events have a funny way of saying, that's nice. Here's what's actually going to happen. So, for example, George W. Bush campaigned on an economic platform. 9/11 happened a few months into his presidency. That dominated what his presidency would go on to become. John McCain positioned himself as the national security president, and then the economy collapsed. And that national security experience didn't really matter a whole lot. Joe Biden campaigned on, restoring the country to normalcy and post-COVID, and a couple of months into his presidency, Russia invaded Ukraine. So we can ask someone to have all of the experience, but that might be asking a bit too much because it's very difficult for one person to have all of the things. And so I think sometimes it's situational. And in this case, I think we got really quite lucky because John Adams had served in Congress. He had written the Massachusetts state constitution. By the way, fun fact, does anyone know what the longest surviving written constitution is in the world? Okay, this is a much more powerful question when I'm not in Massachusetts. Anyway, so he wrote the Massachusetts State Constitution, which was one of the key models that inspired the U.S. Constitution. He had served at The Hague in the Netherlands, he had served in Paris, he had served in London, and he had more diplomatic experience than pretty much anyone in the United States. And that was really important, it turns out, in his presidency when foreign policy was the key challenge of the presidency that he had to grapple with. And so because so few people did have that foreign policy experience, it turns out that he was really quite essential. The thing that he did not have, which I think is pretty important, is some form of executive experience. And that doesn't necessarily even need to be government executive experience, but he did not have any experience with managing other men. He had served in Congress in a collaborative fashion, or sometimes less than collaborative, but in theory, a collaborative fashion. He had served in diplomacy, which is a negotiation, but he didn't ever really see how important it was to develop the relationships between subordinates and the president. And so he did not realize how essential those personal interactions were to the functioning of the president. And I think that's one thing that most presidents have learned, maybe the hard way, is really, really essential.
Well, and he's following a president who was a general, right? If there's anyone who knows how to command men, right? Like, tell them what to do and they do it,
It's
right?
true. Well, I mean, both in terms of like the command, but also one of Adams's big challenges was Washington's use of executive power was never contested. Because everyone thought so highly of him, or even if they didn't think so highly of him and disagreed, they weren't going to say it publicly because it would rebound to their detriment. And so when Washington made decisions, they generally weren't questioned. And his subordinates, even if they disagreed with him, they would tell him so prior to making a decision. But once he made the decision, that was it. And so Adams did not have that stature. He did not have that type of unquestionable respect. And so when he was making decisions, his subordinates were like, I think we're going to do it this way instead. And that is both an interpersonal challenge, but it's also a challenge of how the executive branch is actually going to function. Because they were advocating for an executive that was very much like the British cabinet, sort of like a shared executive power. And he was trying to defend an executive that was in the model that Washington had created. So it has real institutional ramifications as well.
And he was also Washington's vice president, right? He was his VP. So here we have a president and his vice president, and the vice president succeeding him with his own vice president who would become president. So what was the relationship historically between those two positions? Because I think this is what fascinates me. Revolutionary America is not my field, but it always fascinates me because I'm like, they didn't know what they were doing. Like, we take for granted so much what exists now in our political culture, and they were just
Making it up.
Making it up.
Yep.
And they were creating this system that we now have today that seems like so solidified, but it really wasn't.
Yeah.
So what was that relationship like between not only Adams and Washington, but also Adams then and Jefferson?
So not only were they making it up, they were often making it up on the fly. And in real time, in response to challenges that they were facing organically. And so when Washington first came into office, he asked Adams for advice on a number of issues. And they had known each other for a long time. I think they had a lot of respect for one another. They weren't necessarily close, but they planned to at least work together. But there was a question of what would the vice president do? Because the Constitution says two things. Basically, have a pulse, and it doesn't say it in those words, I'm paraphrasing, and cast tie-breaking votes in the Senate. And so there was a real question about, what was the vice president a member of the legislative branch, or was it a member of the executive branch? And at the time, they interpreted the vice president as needing to really be in the Senate. And so Adams sat in the Senate every day it was in session. And in the first year, he really tried to kind of lead the Senate through debate until they kindly asked him to keep his mouth shut. So he did. For 7 years, he didn't really say much and said that the vice presidency was the most insignificant office ever created by man, which is actually not the worst thing that people have said about the vice presidents, or vice presidents have said about the vice presidency. And he was really pushed to the side by Washington, I think because he took an unpopular position early on about what the president should be called. This is known as the title controversy. And Adams, having spent all this time in Europe, really worried that diplomats coming from France and London, places like Versailles, would come to Philadelphia and say, what is this podunk backwater new nation nothing? And he thought that if there was an ostentatious title for the president, something like His Elected Majesty and Protector of Our Liberties, that it would inspire respect both among domestic audiences and foreign audiences. And Washington thought that was a terrible idea. And a lot of Americans did, and they dubbed Adams his rotundity, or the dangerous vice. And Adams lost some of his political cred. And so Washington, I think, really sidelined him, never invited him to a single cabinet meeting, did not really discuss things with him. And in the spring of 1796, so almost 8 years into the presidency, they did finally have one deep conversation, and Adams wrote back to Abigail saying it was the first time they had talked about substance. So, the vice president had no governing role, and initially when Adams became president, Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, and he, I believe, wanted to have a bipartisan administration, genuinely include Jefferson in the governing process. That quickly went sideways, and that idea was basically abandoned from that point forward. And from that point until most historians say that Walter Mondale was sort of the turning point, vice presidents had no role in the administration. As a fun experiment, I highly encourage you to go on Wikipedia and look at the list of vice presidents and look at how many years we didn't have one. It's a demonstration of how insignificant it was for most of American history. Walter Mondale was the first. He had weekly lunches with Jimmy Carter. He's sort of widely considered to be the first sort of junior partner vice president. Today, when we think of a vice president as genuinely being a partner in the administration, I would actually argue is Dick Cheney's creation. So this is very, very modern history and a very new development in a way that they didn't really anticipate, but they also didn't anticipate the presidency being this big or this powerful.
So why did they create it in the first place? Was it just because if I die, someone needs to be able to take over?
Pretty much.
Is that what it was? So it was succession.
Yeah, it was a succession planning, and it was also, once they had sort of thought about it, it would be a way to have a tie-breaking vote if there was an even number of senators. And of course, yeah.
That, the secession, that didn't really come about until John Tyler died, right? Because it was not codified, and the vice president just said, "Oh, of course, it's me."
Well, it says
Do you
in the
want to repeat the question?
Oh, yes, sorry, thank you, good reminder. So the question was that secession planning didn't become concrete until John Tyler. And you're right, there was a question about what would happen. The Constitution said that in the event of a president's death or removal from office, then the vice president would assume the duties of office. The question when John Tyler assumed the duties of office is, what does assume mean? Does it mean temporary, or does it mean actually become the president? And Tyler pretty emphatically said it means become the president. And John Quincy Adams actually kind of tried to mess with that a little bit, but wasn't successful in challenging it. And so once it became the de facto precedent, then it acquired that sort of legal understanding. So you're right that it was theoretical until that point, but it was at least in the Constitution that the vice president would be the person who would take over the responsibilities, whether that was short-term or long-term. Great question.
And when did they start, sorry, this is just an informational question. When did they start running on a ticket together? Instead of, because this is a kind of major dramatic point in the first couple of chapters because they're counting the votes. And it was whoever kind of had the most votes was the president, and second most was vice president. So this is how you get Adams and Jefferson from two different parties as the president and the VP, but obviously that's not what happens today.
So as early as 1796, there was a gentleman's agreement among the two parties. And when I say parties, they're really baby parties. They're not like the political infrastructure that we think of today. But the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans had sort of a secret caucus, and they decided on their two candidates. And the idea was there was a verbal agreement that one was going to be the presidential candidate and one was going to be the vice presidential candidate. But it wasn't specified on a ballot, which is what led to both Adams being president and Thomas Jefferson being vice president, and also the tie in 1800. Spoiler alert, if you didn't know that was coming. But in 1803, Congress passed the 12th Amendment. And that changed the way the elections were conducted to specify that there would be a presidential candidate and a vice presidential candidate, and you would vote for one of the two, basically, slates of candidates.
Excellent. So in your research process, how did you deal with, because, when you study political history, unlike a lot of other fields, there's so much material, everyone's writing everything down, people are saving their letters because they know they are important. And so they keep them all, they may burn some, but they keep most. So how did you deal with such a huge number of documents produced during even this short kind of 4-year time period?
Yeah, it's a very distinct type of challenge. A lot of historians that we know, they're sometimes dealing with 10 documents, and they're trying to piece a story together of someone's life that is not very well documented in the written record. And that is a very separate type of challenge. I'm dealing with 10,000 documents, or in the case of Washington's lifetime, he wrote close to 100,000 documents. So it's just a very different type of work product, and it means reading a lot of things that are going to be irrelevant, reading a lot of things that don't necessarily contribute to your story. And I'm constantly trying to improve the process with which I manage my sources. But for me, it was just a matter of going systematically, and as I would write a chapter, I would read the materials for that chapter and flag the things that I thought were really important and set them aside, and then work on the chapter. And then what that meant, though, was I would say I was a good 2/3 through the book where I was like, okay, I finally have my argument. I know exactly what I'm doing. So that I had to go back and do some revision. But I found that type of writing process was actually much more organic and led to, I think, a compelling story than trying to pick documents and force it from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. And was there any kind of archival silence regarding Adams where maybe you expected him to talk a lot about a particular event or a particular, issue he had to face and discuss, but actually he's completely silent on it, or just not saying the kinds of things you would expect him to say?
There are a couple of moments when he goes quiet, and I wish he didn't. So one occurred very early in the book when George Washington published his farewell address announcing his retirement, and he hadn't told Adams that this announcement was coming. And Adams went suspiciously silent in both his diary and his letters for several months, which at that point was quite unusual for him because he had been meticulous about his diary keeping up until that point. The other is on the Alien and Sedition Acts. He signed them. He didn't ask for them, and he did not try and whip votes for them, but he did sign them. And I wish I knew exactly why, and I wish I knew how much influence Abigail had as part of that decision, because she was actually more avidly in favor of the legislation than he was, I think, based on kind of what I can piece together. But I wish I knew that the challenge was that they were together at the time. So they were not writing letters. And that is almost always the very best source of what he was thinking. The one other silence, and I say this at every event because at some point someone is going to have an answer for me. I cannot find John Adams' dress sword. At the time, it was custom that when you went to a European court, you had to have a dress sword that would hang on your belt. And Adams ordered his in 1778 when he went to France for the first time. He wore it in France, he wore it in London, he wore it at The Hague, he wore it as vice president, and he wore it as president. The Adams family generally doesn't throw things away. And if you've been to their house, they have every single piece of china that Abigail brought back from France, which is extraordinary. And they kept pretty good documentation of what they were leaving to people. I cannot find the sword. I don't know where it is. I don't know what happened to it. So if anyone has it in their closet, can you just tell me? I just want to know where it is. I just want to know where it is. So anyone out there, if you have any hints, I'd love to know.
Yeah, and the Concord Museum people.
You guys have some swords in your
Storage?
archives that we
Yeah,
can pour
if
through?
you have any unidentified rapiers, let us know, please.
Yes, it was apparently quite beautiful. It was called a short sword, and it was silver, and it had this beautiful sort of filigree in the handle, and it was quite distinct because his daughter, when she came to visit him in London, walked in the room and recognized it immediately. So it was not something you would just get rid of, and they were usually treasured gifts that you would hand down. I can't find it. It's driving me crazy.
I think maybe you need to write a novel about this. Like it's the case of the missing Adams sword.
Yeah, or I'm just gonna go start like knocking on doors in Massachusetts. Be like, excuse me, can I please look in your closets? Your attic.
That would not be unusual at all. I'd be like, okay, are you a historian? Yes. So what surprised you most about Adams and the presidency and the sort of kind of origins of the presidency and presidential norms that you discovered while looking into Adams?
So there are a couple of things that surprised me. Adams was far more politically savvy than I anticipated that he would be. He was a far better politician than we are led to expect. Usually we attribute those skills to Madison or Hamilton, and there are some moments, there's a letter collection by Theodore Sedgwick at the Massachusetts Historical Society that's not digitized. So not too many people have gone through it, and there's some amazing letters in there that really reveal the scope and the skill of Adams' political savvy. I was surprised by how self-deprecating he was. One of my very favorite letters occurs early on in his presidency where Abigail was here because John's mother was dying, and so she was staying home to take care of John's mother. And Adams was moving into the president's house and totally overwhelmed by details, and he writes her this letter that says, I need you to come here, I need you to come be with me. And she says, well, I can't do that. Your mother's dying, I'm trying to take care of her. And he writes, I quote, but what about my feelings? What about my needs? Why don't you care about me? And then at the end he writes, don't laugh. Because he knows he's being ridiculous. And that sort of self-awareness is lovely to read and amazing to find in the archives. And then in terms of the presidency, the norms and the development of the institution, after I wrote my first book, I really thought, okay, Washington created the presidency. And he did. But that untested nature of so many of the decisions he made, I hadn't realized how untested they were until I really started digging into the Adams administration and saw how much pushback he received and how hard he had to fight to do the same things that Washington did just like that. So that was a surprise to me, and I think really interesting for me to see how the presidency did continue to evolve long past the time the Constitution was written in 1787.
It would be nice if a lot of our presidential candidates had some self-awareness, right? That would be a delight.
A sense of humor is also
and a
really
sense of
great.
humor.
It's really important to have a president with a sense of humor because
Yes,
the
please.
job is really hard and
Yeah.
you're going to have a lot of bad moments, and so a sense of humor is quite essential.
Absolutely. Okay, questions from our,
Okay.
we have a
Go in
lot.
the back.
Yes.
This is great, thank you. Was, when Adams came into the presidency, was it a smooth transition without controversy? And do you think they were aware at the time of the significance of making sure that it was?
Love this question, thank you. So the question was, when Adams came into the presidency, was the transition smooth, and were they aware of the significance? It was smooth, but it was very much crafted by design, both by Washington and Adams, to provide symbolic importance to that moment. Washington attended, which was a surprise to most people. There was no expectation of a former president attending the inauguration, and that precedent was actually not established until 1845. But they were also keenly aware of what that meant. So Washington, after Adams gave his inaugural address and took the oath of office, he walked out of the room and Washington walked out behind him. And it was probably the first time in 2 decades Washington had walked behind another man outside of a room. And the people in the room wrote in their diaries and wrote letters back to their family describing that everyone in the room had tears streaming down their face and that it was the most sublime thing in human history. We might think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but they recognized the historic importance of this thing, especially given that it was in the context of the French Revolution, when transitions cannot be guaranteed to be smooth and peaceful. And so they were very aware and very proud of this moment. Yes?
I know that most people know somewhat about John Quincy Adams, but I'm interested in, the rest of his family. What was John Adams like as a father? Who were his other offspring? Did any of them achieve what John Quincy did? And can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So John Adams was complex as a father. They had 4 children survive to adulthood. They had 3 sons and a daughter. Abigail Adams was their daughter. She had a really difficult marriage and died young from breast cancer, but he was very close to her. John Quincy was his eldest son. He was certainly closest to John Quincy because John Quincy had come with him to Europe to serve as his private secretary when I think he was 12. And at that point, I think he spoke already 4 languages. So if you ever want to feel like a slacker, read about John Quincy Adams because
That's right.
they were very close. They had a very close relationship until John Adams died. And in fact, after John Adams died, John Quincy wrote every year in his diary about how bittersweet July 4th was to him because it was both the celebration of American independence and the anniversary of the death of his father, who he just, I think, adored. John's relationship with the other sons was more complex because he had spent less time with them. They didn't initially come over to Europe. He didn't know them as well, and they were growing up. They also struggled with alcoholism, and there was a really unfortunate tradition in the Adams family where the ability to achieve and be hugely ambitious and also to live up to the Adams legacy seemed to concentrate in one person, and the other sons tended to really struggle with that. So Charles Adams was the youngest son, and he died of alcoholism when Adams was president. And Thomas Boylston Adams, who was the middle son, died relatively young as well and really struggled. Yes?
Why did he lose the election in 1800?
Okay, so the question is, why did he lose the election of 1800? So the first most important structural answer is the 3/5 clause. If it were not for the 3/5 clause, which gave the Southerns, so for those of you who don't know, in the Constitution as initially crafted, population was assessed for Congress and for the Electoral College based on the white population and 3 out of every 5 enslaved individuals or people of color. And that meant that the southern states, which had very large populations of enslaved and free black individuals, had inflated numbers in both Congress and in the Electoral College. If not for the 3/5 clause, John Adams would have won.
So, do you think Hamilton had anything going on behind the scenes there?
So then the secondary piece of that is, okay, let's put aside the structural piece. He won in 1796, even though the 3/5 clause was in existence. So what changed in 1800? And I think there were a couple of things. One, the Federalist program, which included the Alien Institution Acts, but also included a giant standing army and very expensive taxes to pay for said army, was incredibly unpopular. These were the same Americans that had rebelled against a standing army and taxes just 20 years before. And so a lot of Americans blamed the Federalists, especially the more extreme Federalists, for this entire agenda. They didn't necessarily blame Adams for it, but they did blame the party. There was also a very intense divide within the party that was between the extreme wing led by Hamilton and the more moderate wing, Adams. And I think it led to what I might call an enthusiasm problem among Federalist voters. I don't think that Hamilton's pamphlet in October of 1800 actually had that much impact, but the constant intra-party fighting, the sniping at Adams, did lead to, I think, a low morale problem. Yes?
Yes. Did John Adams have the military experience that Washington that we all know about had? And do you think that is a requisite experience that the presidency should hold, given the responsibility
Sure.
of the forces?
So the question is, did Adams have any military experience, and do I think that that should be required for presidents? He did not have any military experience. It was something he, when the possibility of war came up, was a little bit self-conscious about, and one of the reasons he asked Washington to come back as the commander-in-chief of this new expanded army. I'm of mixed mind, because I do think that military experience can be quite useful. People with military experience tend to be less likely to send armies into war, and only to do so when it's really important because they know the cost. In our current moment, however, because we do have a professional volunteer army, people tend to do that as a profession. They tend not to go into politics. There are some exceptions, and actually we're seeing a new wave of veterans that are coming in that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan coming into politics. But for a while, that wasn't really the case. I do think it can be really helpful, but I'm not sure it's the only type of service that is meaningful, and especially because we do have such a professional army at this point, I don't think that a president needs to have an in-depth knowledge of like strategy and tactics in the way that they would in the 1790s. Yes?
Do you think if someone else had been the second president, the office would have evolved differently? And maybe you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so the question was, if someone else had been president, would the office have evolved differently? So this is a really interesting hypothetical. So I think in 1801, when Jefferson became president, he was actually a little bit sobered by how close the country had come to completely falling apart in the election of 1800. It had come perilously close. And as a result, he was much more temperate and moderate with what he did in office, and actually retained most of John Adams and George Washington's sort of institutional practices, if not their dress and social practices. I think if he had become president in 1797, I genuinely don't know if the nation would have survived, because he was very eager to make amends with France in a way that would have been quite detrimental, and very eager to pursue war with Great Britain, which is generally never a good idea for a new nation to go to war with the most powerful navy in the world. In terms of how the presidency would have evolved differently if someone else had been in the position, I think that few people would have been able to withstand the pressures from Congress and from the cabinet to cede power. And so I think we would have seen more of a prime minister type situation than a strong executive, because I think the cabinet would have carved out influence for itself and been able to dominate other people. Thank you for that question. Chris.
You talked about, you subtitled the precedents that made the presidency. One of the precedents, it seems to me, that has never been followed since was Adams' decision to accept Washington's entire cabinet, second cabinet, which was, I think, a disaster for him, personally. And I don't know of any other president that has done that. And the question is, have you seen any evidence that others looked back and said, that was a huge mistake, we'll never do that again?
So the question is, John Adams kept Washington's cabinet, and have any other presidents done that? And have any other presidents looked back and said, wow, that was a really bad idea? You're right, it was a really bad idea. Although, to be fair to John Adams, he had very good reasons to do so, because he thought it would be providing institutional stability for a nation that was very nervous about this transition. He knew how difficult the positions were to fill. Most people didn't want these jobs because they were difficult and they weren't that well paid, and you were going to be away from home for months and months and months at a time, and travel was awful. And lastly, he worried that if he replaced them, that would be seen maybe as a rebuke of Washington's judgment, and that was not something he wanted to mess with. However, are there any Pickering descendants in this room? Great. I can be honest. They were terrible. Not all of them. Charles Lee, who was the Attorney General, was actually a pretty good Attorney General. Timothy Pickering is one of the all-time worst secretaries of state. He was rude and nasty, and by the end, outwardly insubordinate. And Adams finally fired him, which is one of my most favorite moments in the book, because that's such a moment of satisfaction. And in doing so, establishes really critical precedents. And pretty much the only president who has not in some way learned the lesson from Adams' very poor experience was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson kept Lincoln's cabinet. And that went for different reasons, quite poorly as well. It led to his, for a lot of, well, Andrew Johnson sucks. I'm not supposed to say that.
Oh, but he does. Agreed.
Yeah, he was terrible, but his cabinet really led to his impeachment. So, apologies for the language. But most presidents, for a number of reasons, have looked back and recognized that it's a really bad idea to keep your predecessor's cabinet because you're never going to match up in their estimation, especially if they die in office, and you really need to have those personal relationships. Yes?
I saw a quote at the National Portrait Gallery where Adams said something to the, like, no one who has ever held the office of President of the United States would congratulate a friend for attaining the office. How do you think he felt about being, well, other than what he said there, about his experience as president?
I think there were some things he was really proud of. He was really proud of the peace treaty he signed with France. It was called the Treaty of Mortefontaine. To this day, the United States has been at peace with France. It's one of our longest lasting alliances and one of the longest lasting peaceful alliances in the world. It was what he said he would be happy to have on his tombstone. I think that he was incredibly proud that he ensured a peaceful transition, especially in 1801. And I think that he believed that he left the presidency in a stronger place than where he inherited it, and that was an enormous contribution. That being said, it was not a fun time. He received a lot of criticism from members of his own party, from people who he had counted as friends for decades. Most of his most virulent critics were from Massachusetts, who he had known since he was young. And that is an unpleasant experience for anyone. And I think that he felt largely that a lot of his contributions were not necessarily appreciated by the American people, and he hoped that over time in history they would be.
And one final question for you. Are all the best presidents from Massachusetts?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag. Certainly some of the most interesting. People often ask me, who is your favorite president? And I say, well, that's actually a complicated question. If I ask who I think is the best, I would say Washington and Lincoln. But who do I think is the most interesting? I would say John Quincy Adams and Theodore Roosevelt. So some really good Massachusetts representation there.
Yes.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. This was such a
Yes.
pleasure. And thank you for your questions.